Why do bad things happen to good people? That's a question that we have to wrestle with. It's going to be a challenging one to try to wrap your head around. And we wonder if there's any more difficult questions than that. Well, I think there is. Why do bad things happen to good people certainly is a difficult question. What makes it harder is when it's personal. Not why do bad things happen to good people, but this. How do those good people respond? Because there's always a response. We will face times in our life when something breaks. Maybe it's your body, a relationship, something in your family, your career. And what breaks most of all is our hearts. And we look around at the smashed pieces of what once was, and we wonder who's ever going to fix it. We might be facing, even today, a difficult, desperate, even unfair personal struggle. And through it all, we might wonder where God's face is. Where's God's face in this? Is his face turned towards me? And if it is, what's he looking for? What do you want, God? What do you want to accomplish here? What are you looking for? A bad thing happened to a good person. What response are you looking for? A bad thing happened. What good response could you possibly be looking for? Well, there's always a response. So I think what happens, why do bad things happen to good people? Yeah, that's tough. But even tougher is, how do good people respond when bad things happen? You've been there. You know the question that I'm asking. And you've struggled through those things yourself. And so today, let's let a widow be the window that we look through to help us try to answer that. That's a question that we do need to answer. It's so real to us, maybe even in this moment. Let's stand together. We're going to read the story in 2 Kings chapter 4. We're in a series called The Living Edge. And we're looking at these two men, Elijah and Elisha, these great prophets of God, and life lessons that we can glean from their own lives. And this just happens to be a story in the life of Elisha in 2 Kings chapter 4. It says, the wife of a man from the company of the prophets cried out to Elisha, your servant, my husband, is dead. And you know that he revered the Lord. But now his creditor is coming to make my two boys as his slaves. Elisha replied to her, how can I help you? Tell me, what do you have in your house? Your servant has nothing there at all, she said, except a small jar of olive oil. Elisha said, go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for just a few. Then go inside and shut the door behind you and your sons. Pour oil into all the jars, and as each is filled, put it to one side. She left him and shut the door behind her and her sons. They brought the jars to her, and she kept pouring. When all the jars were full, she said to her son, bring me another one. But he replied, there is not a jar left. Then the oil stopped flowing. She went and told the man of God, and he said, go, sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your sons can live on what is left. This is God's word to us today. Please be seated. And we're going to get into it. In this passage, we're introduced to who? We're introduced to a lady who's facing difficulty. Let's just say that. Bad things, heartbreaking things have happened. Her husband is now dead. Life smashed. And not just that, but now the man that he owed money to is coming for full payment in the form of her two sons. You think she's struggling? Yeah. Bad things have happened to good people. And she is struggling. This is a good man. I mean, listen to how she describes her husband. Your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that he revered the Lord. I mean, this is a good man. This is a faithful servant of God, a man with convictions. And convictions that no doubt his wife shared, as through the struggle, she doesn't go to anybody. She goes to the great prophet Elisha. Because bad things have just happened to good people. And how are those good people supposed to respond? How is she supposed to respond to this? The first part of verse 2. Elisha replied to her, "How can I help you?" Now, foundational to us moving past this first section and getting into some of the more practical things for us personally is to understand this foundational truth in all of this. It's one that we need to stand on. Even in those moments when life is shaky and our knees shake and quake through it, we need to understand this. In the face of personal struggle, God has turned his face to you. Okay, hear that. In the face of a personal struggle, God turns his face to you. And you might be asking, well, I don't see God in this story yet. Where's God here? Elisha asked how he can help. Okay, so what? Well, Elisha's not just anybody. Who's Elisha? Elisha's God's man. Elisha was God's spokesman to these people at this time in their life. He was the symbol of the God that this house revered. It's not just anyone. This is God's man. There are going to be times in your life when God sends you into the life of somebody else to help. And there will be times when God sends somebody else your way. Sometimes he sends you somebody else's way to help. That is God's way because God sees the struggle. God sees that struggle. A number of years ago, actually quite a few years ago, I worked with a guy named Jeff. He was really good friends of mine. And him and his wife, Michelle, married just before Danielle and I, and they desperately wanted to have kids. They could not have kids. And it was a real painful time for her in particular, just wanting to be a mom so bad, when finally God answered that prayer. Not just with one, but two. They're going to have twins. And you can just imagine the excitement that they had in their life. Wow, not just one now, but we're going to have two. But early on in her pregnancy, it was apparent that there was difficulty. And those two babies were born very premature. 1 pound, 9 ounces. 1 pound, 11 ounces. And they were told by the doctors there is no way they're going to survive. In fact, you'd be lucky to get one. And I remember we were in London at the time, and they had followed us there to become teachers, and going with Danielle to the hospital, just to be there for our friends. Just to be there, just to help in whatever way we could. And I remember seeing those little babies in that incubator. And I think even Danielle held one. And it was so tiny, she could hold it in the palm of her hand. This tiny baby. Both of those babies did survive. Now they're 17 years old, doing well. But I remember at that time just knowing that we were there just to help. See, when we're going through the struggle, God sees them. God sees it. And you're not just anyone who's there to help. You're there because God has seen their struggle. God has seen that pain in someone's life. He knows the struggle that they're facing because he's looking at them. But the question is still, okay, what's he looking for? What's he looking for in you when it's you? Look at verse 2 again. Elisha replied to her, "How can I help you?" And this is what he says, "Tell me, what do you have in your house?" Your servant has nothing there at all, she said, except a small jar of olive oil. What is God looking for? In the face of personal struggle, God is looking for this, first of all. He's looking for faith. And God will use and work with whatever little faith you have. He looks at you and says, just give me what you got. Okay, just give me what you got. And at this moment, this widow doesn't have much. In fact, when Elisha asks her initially, okay, what do you have in your house? What's your answer? Nothing. I got nothing to give here. Nothing. But then she rethinks it and she says, well, actually, I do have a little tiny bit of olive oil. You know, that's an offering of faith, but it's not just an offering of faith. I think it's a pretty accurate measure of her faith at that time. You know what? I don't have a lot to give right now. All I have is just this little tiny bit. And there are those times when we go through these kinds of struggles when we think, man, I got nothing to give here. I got no faith. But if we stood back and looked again, we would know, okay, I got a little bit. I have a little bit, and that's great because you know what? God can work with a little bit of faith. God can work with a little bit. All you got to do is offer it to Him. He can work with a little bit of faith because God does amazing things with a little. I mean, you can think of the time when He fed 5,000 men plus all the women and children with what? A little. Okay, 5 like cracker buns and 2 sardines. That was it. And He took a little and did incredible things. And think about the story of David. God took this little guy, this little shepherd boy, with a sling and a stone, and He didn't just drop a giant. He made a nation run in their tracks. God can use a little. In Matthew 17:20, it says, even if you have faith like a mustard seed, that's not much. Even if you have faith like a mustard seed, just that little bit, you can say to that mountain, move, and it will move. God can use a little bit of faith. He just says, give me what you got. In the face of a personal struggle, God's looking for that faith. And He says, I know it might not be much at this time, but just give me what you got. Just give me that little bit you can offer. When we can give Him faith, there's something else that He needs on top of that. Faith leads to this. Look at verse 3. Elisha said, go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for just a few. In the face of personal struggle, yeah, God's looking for faith, but He's also looking for this. He's looking for obedience. And God is not going to do what you should. And so God says, do what you can. Because there are things God is going to ask us to do. It's true that we can't do God's work for Him. Okay, I think we get that one. Okay, we can't do God's work for Him. Okay, we understand that, but what we also need to understand is God's not going to do our work for us. And neither should we want anybody else to. Okay, there are things that God is going to ask us to do. How often do we find ourselves even praying about things when we're praying about things that actually we could just do right now because we're there? I mean, how often have we prayed a prayer like this? God, thank you for sending me this new neighbor. He's lived across the street from me, and, he really needs to know Jesus. And so would you send someone his way? Just to point him in your direction. Or, God, I messed up at work. Okay, I made a mistake. I made a big mistake. Man, you got to come and fix this. Or, God, my marriage, this relationship, it's in trouble. Send someone to fix it. And I think in moments like that, God looks back and says, hello, like you're there. Okay, you are there. See, there are things that God is going to ask us to do. Okay, and He's asking us to do them. He's saying, do what you can. And when we do what we can, then that's when God promises that we're actually going to be blessed. That's how the blessing is going to come into our life. In Luke 11:28, Jesus says, okay, rather it is those who hear God's word and do it that will be blessed. Or in James 1:25, it says, those who look intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues in it, not forgetting what they heard, but doing it, okay, they will be blessed. There are things that God is going to ask us to do. In the face of personal struggle, He's looking for them. He's looking for our obedience. And all He's saying is, do what you can. Do what you can. Why is that so hard? Why is that so hard? I mean, I was thinking about that this week. It's like, hey, why is it so hard just to do what God tells us to do? And I know sometimes it's scary, but sometimes we treat the things that God's asking us to do like He's going to push us out of an airplane with no parachute. I mean, isn't that how it feels sometimes? It's like we're in the airplane and with no parachute, and God says, okay, go. And we think God's going to like push us out of the plane with no parachute. Okay, that's not what God does. But sometimes it does feel like we're jumping out of a plane, doesn't it? I mean, it's a little scary. And you might not have done that before. You might have some questions about how this is all going to work out. But God doesn't push us out without a parachute, and yet it's a parachute that we need to make sure we pack ourselves. That's something God tells us to do. Okay, you need to pack your parachute, though. And there's one thing that we need to have in our pack that's going to ensure that we actually get to this piece. Because we can have faith that'll lead to obedience, but we're not going to obey without this one key piece, and it's this. In the face of personal struggle, God's looking for humility. Because God's not going to work in ways that we always understand. And so He says, not everyone's going to get this right away. Think about this widow right now. What has she been asked to do? Hey, go ask for empty jars. Have you ever had people at your door asking for empty jars? We have them all the time. Baseball teams, hockey teams, and they come looking for empty jars, right? Because they're going to go get some recycling money. And when they come to the door and they knock and they go, hey, do you have empties? And we're like, well, we don't, but look at that guy. Go to that guy, right? But we ask, well, why are you doing it? Well, it's for hockey, it's for baseball. Elisha said to this lady, go ask for empty jars. Did he say why? Nope. Imagine that widow going to those homes, asking for empty jars. And the neighbors saying, hey, what are you doing with the empty jars? I actually don't know. I don't know. Imagine that. She might have even been a little bit embarrassed going from door to door, asking for these things. She doesn't even know why she needs them yet. Why do you need these jars? I don't know. I don't know what's going on here, actually. I'm just coming to get empty jars. I was told to do this. I don't know why I need them. In Isaiah 55, there's a great verse that says, and my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways. As high as the heaven is above the earth, so are my ways above your ways, and my thoughts above your thoughts. See, sometimes we don't really know where God's going with this. We don't know where all this is going to head. And we don't know why we're doing what we're being told to do. And so to do it, we need humility. We're going to need humility to actually obey these things. In Psalm 149, verse 4, it says, God crowns the humble with victory. Show humility. And we're going to get to the end. In the face of a personal struggle, God's asking for humility. He says you might not understand right away what's going on, but you got to do it. I think at this point in this passage, there's a little saying that might help. I was talking to a friend. I meet him once a month to kind of get together and hold each other accountable. He's a bit of a big brother to me. And as we were talking over breakfast once in the last couple months, he said he said this statement to me. He said, "Those who kneel before God can stand before anyone." Those who kneel before God can stand before anyone. And that got some verses going in my head. Like James 4:10, that says, "Humble yourself in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up." Or that section of Scripture like Ephesians 3, where Ephesians 3:14, Paul says, "And for this reason I kneel before God the Father." Okay, for this reason I kneel. And he goes on to explain who Father God is and what he can do, and basically praying for this church, for God to do those things in their life. And at the end of this prayer, okay, for this reason I kneel, at the end of this prayer, he says, this is the reason. So that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. Those who kneel before God, humility, can stand before anyone. And I think that we get the on the ground part. I mean, when you're going through a personal struggle like this, we know what the ground feels like. I mean, we hit the ground hard during these times. You know, our feet get swept out from underneath us. We hit the ground. We don't know how we're going to get up because all we see is all these smashed pieces of a piece of our life, and everything is broken, especially our hearts. And we wonder, how is this going to get fixed? Hey, we know what the ground feels like. And we wonder if we're ever going to get back up. Well, you can, and you will. If you give God that little bit of faith that's left, if you just obey in those little steps that he's telling you to do, and if you just are humble enough to trust him in his direction. See, if you can fight to get back to your knees, and he will rise you up. He will lift you up. And you will certainly know in your life one more final piece that he's looking for. Look at verse 4. In verse 4, Elisha says, "Then go inside," after getting all these empty jars. Okay, don't forget, she doesn't know what's going on yet. "Then go inside, shut the door behind you and your sons, pour oil into all the jars, and as each is filled, put it to one side." There's one final thing that God's looking for when we go through these painful personal struggles. In the face of personal struggle, God's looking for growth. God's looking for growth. And he is preparing for your future. Okay, God's got vision well ahead of ours. God is preparing for your future. And this is what he says in this moment. He says, you will get through this even better than you expected. This widow, at this struggling time of her life, grows in her relationship with God. She grows. And this growth, this strength that she gains, is for her. Because look at what Elisha says. He says, go inside. Okay, this is not for your neighbors. This is not for anybody else. You're the one going through this. And so this is for you. This is not going to be some public spectacle, some sort of a show on the streets. This is a private moment between God, her, and her two sons. Because he says, go inside, shut the door. This is for her. This is her moment to grow. And this is how she grows. She grows in the knowledge of God's care. Look at verse 5. This is incredible. She left him and shut the door behind her and her sons. They brought the jars to her, and she kept pouring. Wow. She grows in the knowledge of God's care. God really does care for me. God really does care for me. I mean, abundantly more than I maybe even thought. This oil just keeps coming at that moment. She knew God saw her struggle and that He cared for her. She grew in that knowledge. She also grew in the expectancy of His blessing. Look at verse 6. When all the jars were full, she said to her son, "Bring me another one." But he replied, "There is not a jar left." Then the oil stopped flowing. Then the oil stopped flowing. You know what she thought at that moment? What was she thinking? Should have asked for more jars. That's what she's thinking. I should have asked for more jars. And why does she say that? Why is that what she's thinking? Because God can only fill what we bring Him. God can only fill what we bring Him. See, if you want God to fill your life, you got to bring Him your life. And if you want God to fill your family, you bring Him your family. If you want God to fill a relationship, a marriage, you bring God that. God can only fill what you bring Him. And in that moment, she's thinking, I should have brought more. She grew in the expectancy that God can do way more than she even asks or imagines. God can do more. And so next time, if she was told to do that again, which she's not, but if she was, she'd be getting all the jars in the whole city. Okay, she grew in the expectancy of God's blessing. She also grew in the sufficiency of His grace. She knew that God cared for her in a way that He didn't have to. God really did provide. He was good to her at a moment when she didn't have much to give. 2 Corinthians 12:9 says, "My grace is sufficient for you, because my power is made perfect in your weakness." At that moment, she knew the grace of God, how much He really did do. And she also grows in one other way. She grows in the witness of God's character. Now look at verse 7. Verse 7 says this, "She went and told the man of God, and he said this, 'Go sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your sons can live on what is left.'" God sees growing in the witness of His character. Now, why do I say that? Because who's she selling the oil to? She's selling the oil to the people who she asked empty jars from and didn't know why. And now she's got all these full jars of oil going back to her neighbors, selling these jars of oil. And what do those neighbors instantly know about? God cares for this widow. She grew in the witness of His character. God used this moment in her life for those around her to see how real He was. And when we go through these times and when we grow in God's character, other people get to see how big and how wide God's love is for us as well. God cared for a widow. And all these neighbors who had their eyebrows raised, wondering, what's this crazy old lady doing, saw God work in her life. In the face of personal struggle, God's looking for you to grow. He's looking for you to grow in Him. And He says, when you grow, you'll get through this even better than you expected. Because in the face of personal struggle, God's face is turned to you. When I was 6 years old, living in Woodstock, there was a terrible tornado. In fact, we're coming up on the 40-year anniversary of that. It was in August 1979. My dad was a pastor of a little church that's grew into a bigger church. And there was a couple in our church the tornado just completely destroyed everything of theirs. They were farmers out in Oxford County, and we got the call. And so as a little boy, I remember going in my dad's car and seeing all this stuff everywhere in my city. And I remember driving up to the farm. I'd been at that farm before, and seeing all the cattle spread out over the hills, just dead. And there was no barn anymore, and there was not much of a house either. And I remember even like almost 40 years ago, yeah, I'm getting old. Almost 40 years ago, I remember some of those very vivid images in my mind. But probably no more than this. I walked into the house. Again, a house I'd been in before, and they had this gorgeous mirror. So you'd walk into the house and you'd see yourself, just one of you. I remember walking to that house, and that mirror was smashed to smithereens. It was all over the floor. And I remember that picture of just that mirror being smashed. And I can imagine that's what their life felt like. Everything was gone. And what used to be one was just thousands and thousands of broken pieces. But I remember kind of walking into the hallway. Of course, I was being careful, and we all had our shoes on. And I remember kind of this mirror just like spread out. I remember seeing myself in all the pieces. The mirror still worked. And it was still reflecting me back. And when I look back at that time, and I know this family now, they actually moved out to Barrie. At that moment, what they knew was this: God's face was reflected in each and every one of those broken pieces. God's face was turned towards them. And his face was reflected back to them in that smashed image of what life had become. God's face was turned towards them. And so turn your face to him. In the face of a personal struggle, God's face is turned towards you. So turn your face towards him. Let's pray. God, today, again, I don't know how real this message is right now for people. And yet we know it's something that this life happens, and this happens in life. And so perhaps today we're looking back at something, and perhaps today we're looking right in the middle of something. And so God, today, I just pray that this would have been an encouragement to us, because we know this is when rubber hits the road life stuff. This is certainly how life can be at times. And God, so I pray that we would give you what we have. Whatever faith we have, that we would give it to you. I pray that we would do what we can. We would take those small steps you're asking us to make. And God, and I pray that we would know that we're not going to get it right away. So we would show humility to understand that you're bigger than us and you know what you're doing. And God, and I pray as we even venture through these things that we would know we're going to get through this even better than expected, because you want to grow us up to prepare for a great future. So God, today again, I pray that we've been encouraged. I pray that we've been challenged. I pray that we've been comforted by that incredible truth that we know so well, that in the face of a struggle, you turn your face to us. May we look to you for everything that we need in these moments. And I pray these things in your name.